Coming up next on This Week in Computer Hardware, who wants that new MacBook Airs? Intel crippling Haswell K chips, NVIDIA's commitment, new monitors from Monoprice, and more, like Haswell battery life. It's all coming up next on Twitch.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for Twitch is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 222, recorded June 13th, 2013. E3, WWDC, Intel, and AMD. Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware. I'm Patrick Norton, and this is the show on Twit where we try to bring you the most useful, informative, helpful, and exciting news about PC hardware. We cover a little bit of the tablet action, and occasionally we dip our toe into cell phones and consoles. And this week we have dipped our toes, feet, legs, and necks into we are up to our neck in news this week. Ryan Shrout, you've been to E3, WWDC has happened this week. New announcements from Intel, AMD, NVIDIA. There's prices dropping. There's just mayhem everywhere, blood and bones in your teeth. What is the battle that is most exciting for you in hardware this week?
The battle that is most exciting in hardware. Wow. I don't know why it's going to come down to
AMD,
violence all the time with
versus
you.
Yeah, excuse me. What was the last video game you played for 9 hours straight?
I don't know, BioShock or something. I don't know. I don't. So the two major things were E3 and WWDC. I think the stuff that Apple kind of announced was pretty interesting. I think maybe we can start there, or we can start at E3. It's up to you.
Let's let the chat room decide. E3 or
Let's
WWDC.
do E3. I think that's what we had in order. That'll help Burke get us through the episode in a cleaner, safer manner. So let's start with E3.
1080p Oculus Rift, you got your eyeballs inside of it, and it's like, it looks better. Does it still make you want to vomit?
It does, unfortunately. It does. That I was desperately hoping that somehow that would make a change to that result. I mean, so the previous version was 640 by 800 in each eye. This version is 960 by 1080 in each eye. So it's essentially a 1920 by 1080 screen cut in half. And they're giving you one portion of that in each eye. It's a cell phone screen, essentially, that they have rigged up for this with the optics. And the major, I wouldn't say it's the worst problem of the development kit that's out, the kind of currently available developer kit for the Oculus Rift, but it's the most immediately noticeable problem is the whole idea of the screen door effect, where the resolution is so low that you can actually see the delineation between the lines of each pixel. So you see these black lines that kind of look like you're looking at the world through a screen door, hence the term. With the 1080p version, it's almost completely gone. You're more than doubling the number of pixels on the screen, and only in a couple of cases where I was looking at a snow-covered portion of the ground or something like that I kind of see the black lines show up.
To work
I
for
guess. Yeah, I mean, I was kind of looking for them because that's one of my jobs, is to kind of try to find these inconsistencies and that kind of stuff. But I mean, they basically sat me down and said, "Here's the original." I played on that for 90 seconds, a couple minutes, and then they put me in the new one, and the difference is immediately noticeable. It's not 100% perfect. The prototype that we showed a picture of, is very early. Like, they're still deciding what maybe screens they want to use, if they're even going to offer this as like another update to the developer kit, or if they just want to, they kind of told me that basically they were getting tired of people talking about that particular problem with the VR glasses, the whole screen door effect, and they wanted to make sure people knew that they were innovating, that they had the answer to this. They just, they don't want to necessarily immediately release another update to the kit that is still kind of shipping out to people, but that in the future, when we get to a consumer ready version of it, it will be, much better. And they're honest. They say we'd actually like to go above 1080p if we could get a 2K or
display.
4K, something in there where you can't even if you're trying, you can't find pixel deviations and that kind of thing, and so. That it's good. It was much better. It didn't help my issues with my screwed up head and my body's inability to separate reality from fantasy.
I mean,
and
it's not
motion
that sort of
sickness.
you are not the only person I have heard complain about getting motion sickness or feeling motion sickness
Right.
while wearing the Virtuing helmet, the Oculus Rift, the 3D virtual helmet. You are not even. I don't even think you were the third or fourth person I talked to that I know personally that had issues with that. So, you know, it's an issue. When you disconnect, you know, your visual senses from the physical motion of your body, that creates problems. It's you probably get seasick if you're out on a boat in the ocean. I mean,
Right.
you're human.
It's really interesting. We had a discussion about what can they do to fix it. You know, I came in, I said, I'm hoping that this will fix my issue that I had with it, and it did not. And I said, well, what's the next step? What can you guys do? And they said, you know, they admitted that there's not one single thing that's going to fix it. You know, if you decrease latency between movement and reaction on the screen, they think there's maybe 10 or 20 milliseconds more.
Oh wow!
They can take off of that latency. They said that'll be a big step. There's another step in the accuracy of the head tracking sensors, right? So it has to be exactly correct when you look up and exactly correct when you look down. Otherwise, you know, the 31 years of my life where that made sense, all of a sudden something's a little bit off, your brain starts to get confused. And then something that I thought was kind of surprising is he said it's actually almost as much up to the game developer, up to the software developer and how they implement the technology. They had a demo there at E3 at the CCP booth, the EVE Online guys, and they did like a just kind of like a mock-up demo of a in-cockpit shooter, essentially. And just a lot of people that had motion sickness testing out the Oculus Rift actually reported they didn't have it with this implementation because it was smooth and it had like basically you had kind of like a heads-up display framework around it. It always looked like you were looking out of a cockpit. So when you looked up and around, you know, those items stayed stationary.
Sure.
And that kind of
Visual reference.
grounded, yeah, it grounded your brain on what it was doing, right? And so they said they were looking around, and then there was also keys to like if you're always moving forward or you're always moving backwards, that helps a lot too. The stopping and starting can cause a lot of issue, right? So if you're always moving forward, if you're like on a rail shooter where you're kind of looking
I was
around,
gonna say,
not an issue.
The front roller, because instead of the side scroller, the front roller is going to be the primary video gaming environment in 3D.
Right. I mean, it's a really interesting discussion that I had. You know, only had a 30-minute time window there, but they realize that it's not perfect yet. They're going to solve as much of the technical things they can on their side, but then there's an artistic side and how you actually implement the technology that will help as well. And they said they have like thought about, you know, can you take Dramamine? Can you take those what do they call them? Prego pops, you know, those kind of anti-morning sickness popsicles that pregnant women can eat to supposedly solve some of that. And they're like, they're trying out all these different things internally to see what actually helps out.
There's a pressure point on the inner wrist. You could wear a little bead on a sort of a thing that wraps around your wrist. I'm gonna say though, if I have to eat a Prego pop before I go online to play a first-person shooter, this is going to be a barrier to entry for me for my, you know, $200-$400 piece of hardware. It's interesting. It's exciting. Also exciting, the crew over at Monoprice, providers of so inexpensive HDMI cables, and as of late, so inexpensive alternatives to our beloved named Cat Leap 27-inch high-res monitors from Korea. You got to see the new 27-inch and 30-inch high-res low-cost monitors from Monoprice. What's the story, man?
Yes. So these are actually, I think I had these images backwards on that particular article. But so, you know, we kind of talked about this when they first announced. I think they announced it at CES in January, right? Where they were going to bring these 2560 by 1440 displays into the US. We've talked about it many times here before about buying them on eBay, and then you have to worry about shipping and warranty and dead pixels. Well, they, you know, they're a local company. They're local as in they're in the US at least.
Domestic is a good word.
Yeah, there you go. They're domestic. And I have bought a lot of stuff from them and have had very good experiences with them. I know you have as well. And so it was a big deal seeing a domestic company kind of get into that market. And they've gone from one monitor, now they're already up to four. They have two 27-inch models and two 30-inch models. And the new 27-inch that they just kind of started shipping is like a much thinner design than the previous one, which actually the picture I have on there, it's a little bit hard to tell exactly how thin it is, but it does a very good job. But there's still the part where the DVI connection is and power connection is a little bit, it sticks out some. That's where your VESA mount is and all that kind of stuff. But it was interesting to hear, like I met with their CEO and talked with them about how, they're a company that is used to selling like a $5 HDMI cable. So the idea of suddenly selling a $390 product was a big step for them. And they were very worried about what sales were going to be like and what the return rates were going to be. But, I think they said their first batch, they sold out in like 19 hours or something like that. So they've been very successful. And I think the lowest cost when they had the 27-inch IPS slim 2560 by 1440 is $390. Right. So
which is pretty manageable.
Yeah. I mean, that's a little bit of a premium over those prices that you might be able to still find on eBay, although those have been creeping up a little bit as the popularity grew. Sure. And the Monoprice ones are great. So you can get ones that have just dual link DVI, which does not have an internal scaler. You can get them with HDMI input, VGA input, component input that, it has a scaler inside. And then they have a 30-inch with both options as well. So it was just, for them, it was the first time that they'd ever been to E3. It was the first time they'd ever really kind of gotten into this market. And I think they've found that people are very willing to give them their money when PC gamers, want this kind of product and they're willing to pay for it. And it's a relatively cheap price too. So if you're still on the lookout for one of those 27-inch displays and you're not going to spend the extra money for the 4K. These are something to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, it's funny as you mentioned Redmir cables in there. Robert Heron's done a review of them. They're pretty good. Monoprice is basically bringing the Redmir technology to like an active IC that is powered off the juice on an HDMI cable that allows you to use a lot less copper and create a much thinner cable. But Redmir is an Irish technology company, and it's pretty cool. So they're super, super thin HDMI cables. I'm going to assume it's the Redmir cable in black because it looks a heck of a lot smaller. But they're very competitively priced to regular cables, that you would see in the mall. I mean, you know what I mean? Like a 3-foot ultra slim Redmir HDMI cable is going to cost you $9.90 from Monoprice instead of $3. Right. But compared to what you see HDMI cables for sale at Walgreens, the local drugstore, or Best Buy or Walmart, they are very, very inexpensively priced, and they're nice cables too. It's good stuff. So did you get to touch the Razer Blade, the Haswell-based laptop from the company that makes the over-the-top gaming mice and laptops, or was it behind the glass as it is in this picture?
Nope, I got to go. We got to go in the back and test out some demo units of the Razer Blade and the Razer Blade Pro. The Razer Blade is the 14-inch. 1600 by 900 resolution display, Haswell, a quad core, plus a Geforce GTX 765M GPU part. It looks very, very similar to a MacBook Pro, as you can tell if you look at those pictures, right? But it's a black finish on it instead of like a brushed finish on it. And actually, I like the look of it, but it has much of the same design qualities. It feels good. It's not overly heavy. I think it's just about 4 pounds, maybe just under 4 pounds. Like that test people do with a laptop where they set it on the desk and can they lift the lid up with one hand without holding down the other side? That they're proud of that they've been able to do that. The keyboard on it is actually really good. The trackpad's really good. It's a nice machine, right? The only kind of thing that I immediately, it's like, I kind of wish they'd been able to do something else with is the screen. There's a fairly thick bezel around the side of it. Like the screen is not taking up the full size of the top there. And it's a 1600 by 900 instead of like a 1080p or something screen, which would be nice to see. But starting at $17.99, I believe, pretty high performance and a very thin form factor. And they also had the Razer. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say discrete GPU on that?
Yeah. So it's got the Geforce GTX 765M. So fairly high performance mobility GPU. And that was kind of, I was getting briefed by NVIDIA on their mobile GPUs recently before Haswell released. And they're like, yeah, there's one design. that we really like a lot. It's really thin. It's gotten a really high-powered processor in it and a high-powered GPU in it, and they've done a good job of kind of making it thin, and the cooling infrastructure is really good. But they wouldn't mention it at the time. This is the design that they were referring to. The Razer Blade Pro is like the 17 or 18-inch one that has like that weird touch screen touchpad, like the display slash touchpad with all the programmable buttons, the actual LED buttons and stuff. That's maybe a little bit over the top. You have to have some really specific use cases for it, but it was still interesting to see. And I think it used the same exact CPU and GPU hardware in it, just high resolution screen and that kind of thing. They're cool machines, and Razer has gone from not being in the business at all of making laptops to being a very interesting player. I don't want to say they're like leading anything,
right?
But they're a very interesting player in terms of the designs they've built.
Well, they're trying to set themselves apart. They've done a good job of it. You know, I would love to know, you know, in a year, how many 17-inch notebooks, like how many 14-inch notebooks are selling for every 17-inch notebook, just out of curiosity. Because like, you know, you look at the 17-inch notebook and you want the screen real estate, and then you realize you're going to have to get a new backpack if you want to carry anything around. It's interesting stuff. In other large news this week, that does not involve Google, the NSA, video games, the Xbox One or the PS4, although I was talking to Max and Tara from Rev3 Games, and the general consensus is that Sony won E3, if you were keeping score. But the WWDC, the Worldwide Developers Conference keynote opens with a whole dog pile of products. And as I'm looking over here and trying to pull up my first tab, of course, I was most excited about the MacBook Air. Yep. Haswell based, ridiculous battery life. So we've been talking, like, you know, Intel's been saying 50% battery life increase, which is kind of counterintuitive if you've been listening to Intel spend the last 5 years telling everybody that 90% of the laptop battery life is consumed by the screen and there's nothing you can do about that. And then suddenly, magically, mystically, this new CPU and chipset is delivering ridiculous battery gains. And my comment earlier this week on Techzilla was that, hey, well, either Haswell is delivering these ridiculous battery gains, or they put a ridiculous battery inside of the MacBook Airs. There's like another 500 milliamps. Like the battery goes from like 6,500 milliamps to 7,000 or 7,200 milliamps on the 13-inch MacBook Air. But the MacBook Air is looking and sounding, I mean, I want one desperately and horribly and deeply, and in a way that reminds me a lot of Gollum, right? So battery life goes from 7 to 12 hours on the 13-inch, from 5 to 9 hours on the 11-inch. They both get 802.11a, b, g, and AC. So 802.11ac is now an Apple thing, USB 3.0. I think it's USB 3.0, 4 or 8 gigabytes of RAM, up to a 512 gigabyte SSD. And of course, they have a new Airport Extreme to deliver AC. We'll talk about that in a second. But it was interesting that they to get this out now, they went with the BGA package and the HD 5000 Iris GPU. That was an interesting story that was up on PC Per, and I apologize for not having the name associated with that story.
I mean, the MacBook Air has always been built on BGA parts, right? I mean, in order to get into that thin of a form factor, they've been BGA parts. Ken actually got one in a couple of days ago. I think he got it Wednesday, so maybe just yesterday. We're running it through some CPU tests and that kind of thing currently right now, which upsets him because now he can't just use it as his main machine. I'm making him run it through benchmarks and all that kind of stuff first. But the performance on it is noticeably better. The graphics performance on it is actually really good. This is my first experience using the HD 5000 graphics, so like the actual GT3 version of the Haswell graphics as opposed to the GT2 that exists on all the desktop parts. And our early testing shows that it's very competitive with something like Trinity, which is at a much higher wattage level. So that could be really interesting in terms of performance. And then battery life, we haven't really had a chance to test it. Well, the first thing we did when we bought this new MacBook Air was put Windows on it so that we could run all of our benchmarks and see where the CPU hardware is, see where the GPU hardware is. And our battery test on this was very poor, like really 3.5 to 4 hours in Windows with this. Now, I'm not pinning that on Apple and saying that somehow that's that's what the actual result is. We're gonna, once we finish all of our Windows testing, put OS X back on it and run our same battery test on that. And I imagine it will be much, much better based on some other results I've seen. But it's interesting. It's kind of an interesting data point, right? That there could be this dramatic of a difference on this particular hardware from Windows to Mac due to software of some kind. I'm sure it's not hardware specific.
Well, it's interesting because oh my goodness, you have the moment where you can't find the article you're looking for. So there's a bunch of interesting stuff going on OS 10 Mavericks, right? One of which is that they're compressing what they call it compressed memory in OS 10 10.9. The idea is that, quote, Maverick aims to free RAM, extend battery life. So they call it compressed memory. Quote, and Apple Insider says, the operating system applies data compression to the least important content held in memory to free up more available RAM, and it does so with such efficiency that the CPU and storage devices work less, saving battery as well. So essentially, it's dynamic memory compression on the data that your system is using at the same time. But one of the things, and Gizmodo did a good write-up on it, there's this great picture at the top, and I'll try to drop that into the show notes, but it's like, they're claiming, as Apple, not OS 10, Apple is claiming a 72% reduction in CPU activity, which is, time coalescing, which smooths out the curve of the CPU usage so that rather than alternating between passive and active states, it's more smoothly transitioning. Improvements to Safari that make it more efficient. Technology called AppNap helps the OS focus exactly on what app you're using, so you're not burning up battery life in the background. It'll be really curious, that Mario Aguilar wrote it up for Gizmodo.com. OS 10 Mavericks has huge improvements for battery life, but the reality is we haven't really seen the benchmarks yet. Or we have the benchmarks are just starting to come out now in terms of battery life. And they're all really concentrating on OS 10 for semi-obvious reasons.
Sure. I mean, I would say all of our testing has been done in Windows right now. The CPU is pretty good, under that of what Trinity performance looks like, but that's, a desktop level processor, and then the graphics seems kind of on par. I think it's actually going to turn out to be a really, really high performance system. I'm just starting to get, we just got 2 Haswell Windows based laptops in from MSI, one like a high end gaming one and one kind of a thinner, lighter gaming machine, and we have a couple of Novos on the way too, so we'll have some better data points. But I think if Apple tends to be more accurate with their battery kind of claims than a lot of other hardware vendors tend to be. And if that turns out to be the case, I mean, a 12-hour battery on a 12 hours of battery on a 13-inch MacBook Pro is an incredibly awesome result, right? And that would change a lot of things. That if I can buy that, and if I can figure out how to get that kind of battery life on Windows on that particular hardware, then maybe I would make that move as well. So I mean, there's a lot of good that can come out of that, and I think the Haswell performance is impressing me more than I thought it would in terms of the low end. I would say the low power integrated graphics.
Oh, here we go. Tim Stevens review up on Engadget.com. And I just had it in front of me. They are 12 hours and 51 minutes of battery life compared to the 13-inch MacBook Pro with Retina display of 607, 13-inch MacBook Pro mid-2012, 651, and the previous 13-inch MacBook Air of 6 hours and 34 minutes. That is a monster increase in battery life. And Tim does good work.
Now, it's interesting. If you look at that, the 13-inch MacBook Air versus the 13-inch MacBook Pro with Retina, we're talking about a 1.3 gigahertz processor versus a 2.5 gigahertz processor. So almost twice the frequency on the CPU. So that's going to be a noticeable performance result, even though here is like the X Bench is only showing moderate 304 to 378 results. I don't know what that is in terms of actual relative performance. That's why I hate seeing results
somebody
like
else's
that.
artificial benchmarks.
X Bench with just a number, like there's no background information on exactly what it is.
Well, it's a contextual reference like any other synthetic benchmark.
yeah.
And if you're not familiar with it, you're uncomfortable with it, you're feeling a lack of comfort due to a lack of familiarity, Ryan. If you want to spend the next few months of your life running Xbench, I'm sure you'll be okay with it in the future.
Yeah.
But we also didn't really expect, massive increases in performance. I mean, you got to think about it. There's a bunch of stuff going on here. There's an operating system. There's basically a semi-custom motherboard design with Intel's new Haswell hardware and CPU for Apple. There's a new operating system going on here that hasn't really, hit major, or basically is hitting major release now. So it'll be interesting to see where it stabilizes in a few weeks and what happens. I got to say, I desperately. I try to get like 4 years out of a laptop. I've gotten 5 years out of a laptop kind of accidentally. I think I've gotten 4 years out of a laptop accidentally, but I desperately want to upgrade my 2-year-old MacBook Air right now just to have that battery life. PCI Express based SSD in the new MacBook Air. This is probably the first, we got it right up here from PCPer.com. That Ken Addison wrote up. And it's pretty crazy, right? Because Anand was writing about this. Probably the first time we've seen PCI Express-based drive, a PCI Express-based drive in a mainstream computer. Pardon me while I sneeze really quickly. Burke, you might want to switch. Sorry about that, everyone.
It was impressive. Like where should we start?
In 3, 2. Another interesting element about this, Ken Addison wrote this up for PC Per. Anand spent a bunch of time talking about this on anandtech.com. This is really the first PCI Express-based drive system we've seen in the mainstream product. And this is a little bit more complicated than just saying, hey, the hard drive is soldered to the motherboard, because it's not. Unlike almost everything else inside of the MacBook Air except for the batteries. But it's interesting what's going on in terms of how this impacts performance and how does it differ from most of our existing hard drive systems.
So it was interesting. I think the very first, somebody got their hands on before they did a full review of the MacBook Air, and they did a test, and they got something like 680 megabytes per second read speeds on the SSD, and they didn't really question it. And the first thing I thought of was, well, that's outside the SATA 6 spec, right? So that's running faster than SATA can actually run. So something else was going on here. Then we had a dissection. We saw that there was a PCI Express based controller. Well, as it turns out, Apple's using the same Marvell 88. I guess it's just the 9183 controller that Plex Store was showing with the first kind of generation of the M.2 form factor SSDs at CES this year. And the M.2 is kind of like a derivative of just a PCI Express interface, so it does not have the bottleneck of SATA 6. But the not surprising result of this is that Apple is maybe using that standard, but they're not using the standard connector. The connector that they're using on this particular SSD is different than the actual M.2 connector that we saw available on the Asus Z87 motherboards, for example, right? And they're going to be in all kinds of other form factors very soon. So it still looks like it's maintained some kind of partial proprietary connection type on that. But in terms of performance, it's really impressive. I mean, just a real quick result that Ken got out of it is he ran the Blackmagic design disk speed test, where he got 552 megabytes per second write and 723 megs per second read speeds off of this SSD. So more than fast enough, I think, for any jobs that you're going to be doing on a MacBook Air with a 1.3 gigahertz processor, right? So it's impressive. There's just one more thing to take a bottleneck away from the system on any doubt about there being a bottleneck from it, right? And that should improve sleep times and resume times and all that kind of stuff as well, which is good.
From nearly imperceptible to delete expletive near totally imperceptible. iFixit. I love iFixit so much. They did what iFixit does. They did a teardown almost immediately of the new MacBook Air 13-inch mid-2013 model. You know, and I'm always sort of torn between being really, really excited and really, really horrified when they do this because, you know, it's a brand new piece of hardware. One of the things they pointed out is because the design is so slim and so flat. I mean, one thing to look at is if you go like one more slide down, Burke, you'll see the ridiculous, gigantic pile of battery action going on there.
Yeah.
And, you know, 7.6 volt, 7150 milliamp battery. 2012 had a 7.3 volt, 6700 milliamp hour battery. But, you know, that's not a huge increase in capacity. Basically the PCI Express hard drive module there that you see, and then there's the new airport card, and then things get really brutal in terms of disassembly because it's amazing how densely packed this computer is for obvious reasons. I mean, the thing's ridiculously thin. They gave it an overall score of 4 points for repairability, mostly because there's just not much you can repair. You know, quote, once you manage to take off the bottom cover, all the parts are pretty easily replaceable. But everything, RAM and SSD, are proprietary. And there's just, you know, if anything goes wrong, you're probably replacing a big chunk of hardware. So not going to be a big used parts market there. On the upside, the construction is, as somebody who's carried one of these for a couple of years now, the construction is much more robust than it looks, as long as you don't drop the screen on a piece of steel table leg. Not that I know anything about that. Airport Extreme gets extremely high marks for repairability, like an 8. And it's a really interesting design. It's funny, they're definitely kind of changing styles here. They're going for very vertical designs. The Airport Extreme 8 1521. So this is the new Airport Extreme that goes along with the 802.11 AC, and it's a pretty different design. You can see they flip it upside down to pop the bottom off, and you can see where the air vents are down around the bottom. It's pretty cool, you know, if you like.
It's a really, I
wireless
thought,
routers.
an innovative way to get around like the whole idea of antennas, right?
Sure.
You need antennas are, you know, they thrive on surface area, and this creates a good amount of surface area, and they kind of, you know, hit it behind a plastic shell as well, so it's not ugly in their mind. Right. It's a cool piece of hardware, right? Everything that they kind of announced over this week turned out to be pretty cool.
It's funny, they pointed out that it's the first, you know, the latest. It's the first Apple product with huge amounts of empty space with vertical boards around it. Because the other one, of course, they had a great picture of the interiors of is the new Mac Pro. Grossly overdue. I'm adding in another link on there underneath the Mac Pro entry. Right. And it's so funny. Obviously, the Mac Pro, in some ways, so much of the same server class, incredibly expensive server class hardware because you need server class hardware for the professional desktop, which I don't get, and everybody with that's built a Hackintosh in the last couple of years doesn't get. But what a radical change. And if you look at that, you know, there's the Mac Pro itself, which is this kind of cylinder, this incredibly stylish black cylinder. And then it's literally, as iFixit points out, a big old chunk of empty airspace surrounded by vertical circuit boards. And it's a really, really interesting change, and also insanely proprietary.
Yes.
If that motherboard goes down, kids, you're not swapping in a replacement. Not from Newegg, not from Amazon, and maybe from eBay, but you'll be paying big dollars for it. It's a nice piece of design. They
got a lot of hardware in that small of a space, right? They got two Tahiti GPUs, two Radeon HE7970s, essentially FirePro derivatives of, and then an unnamed 12-core processor, and that's, I mean, it's not a secret. It's going to be an Ivy Bridge E processor, and they can't announce it, they can't show it, they can't sell it because that processor's not out yet. But I mean, in terms of like, I thought the most telling graphic they had was where they showed it sitting next to the last generation's Mac Pro machine, right? And they showed the scale difference.
Is it like a quarter the size?
It's way, like in terms of actual space, height wise, it might be a quarter of the height. Maybe
I
a
love
third
they call
of the
it
height.
the empty space in the middle is a unified thermal core, an unprecedented amount of power in an unthinkable amount of space. And you can actually do expansion, kind of. Thunderbolt 2, USB 3, Gigabit Ethernet, HDMI 1.4. Internal expansion, not so much, but with Thunderbolt 2, less of an issue. Man, I gotta say, I'm excited. And on the upside, I trust Apple's engineers to actually deliver something that'll work. Because I think about, there were a bunch of years, you had 10 inches tall, like 6.5, 9.9 inches tall, diameter of 6.6 inches. It is ridiculously small. I always think about, like, how many times did we see in the mid to late 90s where people were reinventing the format of the PC, and you ended up with these crazy proprietary motherboards from HP or unnamed, Taiwanese manufacturers that if anything went wrong, it bricked the entire box. But they were stylish, and they were visually engaging, and they were radical, and they were cool as hell, and they were freaking unupgradable in most cases. But I
do wonder if Thunderbolt expansion will strive forward enough to make that, the fact that that's the only expansion area you have for this system acceptable, right? That you either fall in love with the design and you're willing to sacrifice kind of expandability into certain areas right away, or you trust that the Thunderbolt ecosystem will grow, and maybe you'll have other graphics options through Thunderbolt. We already have some storage options through Thunderbolt. Maybe you'll have video options, display options, any kind of external RAID controller or some other device that you would want to plug in. You're gonna have to use through Thunderbolt through an external PCI Express box, right? So, are the professionals that depend on these types of systems willing to make that sacrifice?
I think in a lot of cases, I mean, it's funny because you're talking about, like, on the current Mac Pro pricing, you're looking at $2,500 for the entry-level quad-core Xeon powered unit, and that comes with 6 gigs of RAM and 1 terabyte hard drive, and an ATI Radeon HD 5770. If you're watching the video and staring at me, trying to figure out what I'm looking at the specs on the Apple Store, and that's $2,500 for about $1,000 worth of hardware. And
this design, it's not going to be cheap.
You dump the Xeon, and it's like $600 worth of hardware, right? I mean,
right.
You know what I mean? It's it's a $2,500 for what's essentially a $600 PC. Yes, you get server reliability, but you know what? A freaking consumer grade desktop processor has consumer reliability. You know how I know that? Look what Google's built their entire ecosystem around, right? Now, Google obviously has a whole lot of servers and failovers and stuff like that, but the 12-core version of the current Mac Pro is $3,800. You know what I mean? This is people that are investing a lot of money for a long period of time. They will adopt these. It's kind of funny because, like, you want to say, like, they're going to adopt them really fast, but okay, the rare video professional that has a $5,000 rendering card, or a rendering card they paid $5,000 for, that can probably be replaced with a AMD or NVIDIA card for a quarter the price or a fifth the price. Is going to be like, I'll stick with the existing Mac Pro, or I'll see whether or not I can use a Thunderbolt adapter box. I can still remember when the iMacs came out back in 98, 99, whatever that was. There were 7 million PCs with USB ports, and there was like a USB accessory that wasn't a mouse. Yep. And then literally the iMac came out, and Jobs had the foresight to push a bunch of some printer manufacturers, some other people, to come up with USB devices, and all of a sudden, man, in 6 months, the iMac did what the PC hadn't done in a couple 3 years, which was foster an ecosystem of new devices using this what at the time was apparently a bleeding edge, port interface for your machine. So, they've done it before. I think they can do it again. And I think they probably know exactly how many people are using any type of expansion device on the Mac Pro. And I think if they thought internal expansion was that necessary, they would have offered it.
Yeah.
All I know is,
I just want to say I love the design. I think it is incredibly awesome looking. I would love to have a PC on my desk like that, but I probably won't want to pay what they're going to ask for, right?
But you'll think about it.
Actually, I know I'm not going to want to pay what they're going to ask for. I can say that without a doubt.
But you're going to think about it for a minute.
I might. I just want to buy one and tear it apart. It's just what I do.
Just let Kyle and the iFixit people do that.
Okay, fair enough.
NVIDIA pledges to buy a commitment ring. I mock NVIDIA, but it's a pretty funny. NVIDIA fascinates me, right? They do a lot of things. NVIDIA is like the guy that sits down at lunch and tells you what he needs you to think about him or her. But you wrote this up, Ryan, so I'm just going to back out of the way and let you explain NVIDIA's reiteration of their dedication to gaming on the PC.
So this was
why?
So NVIDIA is under a lot of stress right now, as a company as a whole, because they've had, I would say, a lackluster adoption of Tegra 4, maybe a lackluster adoption of Shield. We don't really know what that's going to turn out to be like. And then on the whole idea of AMD adopting, or AMD being adopted into all of the consoles now, right? So Wii U, Xbox One, PlayStation 4, they're all powered by AMD APUs with AMD Radeon graphics systems in them. And the kind of general consensus is, and the story that AMD is promoting because of it, is that because all developers now that target consoles, which is a lot or most, are going to be developing towards AMD graphics hardware, any tweaks they put in there for Radeon GPUs, any additional features or technologies that AMD may invent or create from now for the next 5 to 7 years that get implemented into game engines for consoles will waterfall back into the PC. So PC users that get, like whatever the next BioShock game is, or whatever, pick a title. Because it's being built on AMD or for AMD hardware on the consoles, AMD users on the PC will see a benefit as a side effect to that, just automatically type of stuff. And NVIDIA is getting a lot of pressure in that regard, because if that's the case, they lose a lot of mind share in the PC market in terms of selling discrete graphics. So while at E3, they had kind of like a press engagement event where they brought up a whole lot of software developers, and they brought up a lot of NVIDIA team members that work with these game developers to talk about what they work on with these guys, how much they invest in these companies, how much they invest in new technologies, how much they, work with companies like Epic and Crytek and all those guys that create the engines and the games behind all the titles that we love. And so they're basically trying to say, just because AMD's chip is in the console does not mean that the Geforce brand will in any way see negative impact for the next coming years, right? And they're doing some very smart things to make sure that's the case. They're continuing to invest a lot of money and a lot of man hours into creating features like TXAA, which is a very efficient, high-quality anti-aliasing effect, and developing tools like GeForce Experience, which is actually really, really cool for people that want to game on a PC but don't like the complication of gaming on a PC, right? The ability to just have this, if you have a GeForce card and you use this piece of software, it'll detect your game and says, oh, you're going to play BioShock Infinite? I'd recognize your CPU, I recognize your GPU, hit this button, and here's all the settings we think you should use, right? And so they try to make it as close to a console-type experience in terms of ease of use as they can. And those are really, really great tools that AMD doesn't have any kind of equivalent to right now. So they're trying to show that, as I titled the article, reiterate their dedication to gaming, right? And then they're, as you would expect them to be, very adamant that just because AMD's chip is in the Xbox and the PlayStation doesn't mean that somehow they are going to be at a severe disadvantage. NVIDIA and I kind of differ on that opinion. I do think NVIDIA is going to have to work harder to maintain the same level of commitment or mind share from developers and gamers, but I think they're going to have to do it, right? They don't. The Tegra market, their Tegra division is not suddenly floating the entire company. It's Quadro and GeForce still. So they're going to have to force down that road and make sure that they are still as strong today as they are, or as that they will be in the future, or as strong tomorrow as they are today, I guess I should say.
It would be nice.
Yeah.
We got some more information on AMD's 5 gigahertz chip. Jeremy Hellstrom wrote this up for PCPro.com. So the tech report basically confirmed that there's a 220 watt TFP. It is a lot of watts for a contemporary CPU. The FX 9590 and the FX 9370 are 4.7 gigahertz and 4.4 gigahertz for the base clocks. The tech report article is pretty interesting because one of the things they talk about the information they conferred, and they link to a section of their FX 8350 review where they overclocked the Bashira Silicon to a quote 4.5 gigahertz base clock with a 4.8 gigahertz turbo peak, which is very similar to the FX 9370. And then they give you the benchmark results for that, which varied with some things, but generally put it in a Core i7 3770 range. Although in some tasks like I want to say MPEG-4 H.264 compression, it lagged considerably. X264 HD video encoding, one pass. It lagged, however, 2 passes, it was pretty close. I did not see any gaming benchmarks. It's an interesting part, and I keep thinking that, you know, they did 5 gigahertz more because they would get buzz out of it than it was actually a really necessary idea.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the 5 gigahertz mark is something you can put on a press release and get a lot of attention for.
5 gigahertz.
You know, I talked with him at E3 about this part, and it is a 220 watt TDP. It is a four module 8 core design, like we said it was last week. But it's really damn hot. Like, I mean, and they're only going to sell it through system integrators. They're not going to sell it in the retail channel, and that's it's disappointing. So the reason they're doing that is because it uses so much power. You know, you can't put this chip into a low quality motherboard, lesser quality motherboard. Like you can't use a 4-layer PCB motherboard for this. You really need to have something like an 8 or above to really pull the voltage necessary through to get to it, to get to that 5 gigahertz level. And then they can also, so if they do it through system integrators, they have control over what boards they can use and then what cooling they use, and they don't have to worry about return rates and that kind of stuff. I wonder, this to me is a part that should be in the hands of enthusiasts, people that are building their own machines, though, because these are specially bend CPUs, right? These are specially bend parts that are getting to 5 gigahertz at fairly high temperatures and wattage usage and that kind of stuff, but they can still go higher. Like, from everything I'm hearing, most of these parts will go to 5.2, 5.3, 5.4. If you're willing to push more voltage, if you're willing to cool even more than 220 watts of TDP out of that machine. So, and then performance-wise, it wouldn't surprise me at all to see a 5 gigahertz Vishera, AMD Core processor be able to match the 4770K in a lot of tests. At 3 times the power consumption, maybe, but it will at least be able to do it. And so that's, you want to get these parts into people's hands that are fans of AMD, right? I mean, that to me is what you want out there, right? You could give it to people who don't care about the thermal limits, thermal issues, and let them have fun with it and let them continue to be fans of your product and try to promote it some. So it's a little bit confusing to me why they decided to go strictly SI right now, but
yeah, it's a curious part. That's all I'm gonna say about it. Not so curious Intel's movement. This just kind of irritates the hell out of me, and I think I understand why Intel's doing it. But so non-K Haswell processors will not be overclockable. The K parts, the overclockable parts, the enthusiast parts, will not have virtualization in TSX. TSX you probably haven't heard about unless you are a processor geek, which probably includes a large part of our audience. But TSX extensions essentially allow app developers to set off a section of standalone code in a program to kind of run on its own thread. So the idea is if this chunk of code in my 14 million lines of code can run independently, I can throw it off on a different, I can throw that thread off on a different core and sort of increase the increase the multi-threadiness of an application. Tim Very wrote this up for PC Per. He says the vPro and VTD features that are eliminated from the K are used by virtual machine applications, with VTD being more relevant to the consumer side of things. And I just keep looking at this, and all I can think is that the only reason to block virtualization and these other elements from the K Haswell processors is to just keep these out of the hands of like performance in server users or something. It's just it's frustrating. It's like we're going to take the enthusiast parts and take some of the coolest technology out of it, especially for the kind of the consumer grade server market, consumer grade hardware server builder market, and I keep thinking like they do that just to make this a less attractive part maybe for the people who build servers out of consumer grade CPUs. Any thoughts on that, or am I just overthinking it?
You're probably overthinking that portion of it. I really don't know why they separate their product lines like this. I understand the K series versus the non-K series. I'm a little bit aggravated that they took away a couple of overclocking features on the non-K parts.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, okay, I can see some value to that, some point to that in terms of product differentiation. In terms of getting rid of TSX and the virtualization stuff, doesn't really make any sense to me.
Okay.
And there's, as far as I know, and nobody's ever said anything one way or the other, there are no technical reasons why those technologies can't exist in an unlocked system of a processor. If somebody said, hey, we can't run TSX in a situation where you may have varying multipliers applied to your memory bus versus your CPU bus, I might go, I don't really understand that, but sure, that's an excuse I can get behind, right? Okay, fine. You got to disable it then for a potential bug down the road. But they're not saying that. They're just doing it. And it's annoying. They kind of did this with the Ivy Bridge and Sandy Bridge. Which ones? What features? I think there was some virtualization, VTXD, that were left off of the K series parts. And I know the K series parts had the lower end graphics. Last generation as well compared to like the non-K series parts. So they make some weird choices.
They make some choices.
But to be honest, Intel's product guides, their product roadmap, not the roadmap, but their product lineup is so huge and confusing as it is. If you try to research all the Haswell mobility CPUs that exist today, it's nuts. Like I got a laptop that had a Core i7 4702 MQ. I was like, a 4702. I've never heard of that before. I have no idea what a 4702 is.
4702 space site : Intel.
Exactly. So.
Oh man. If you've been thinking about buying a tablet, I want to give you a quick heads up. You can pick up a Nook HD for $129. The 8 GB version, the 16 GB version costs like $149. The HD Plus, the 9-inch Nook tablet, is selling for $149. It's basically a big, like 3-4 day Father's Day sale from Barnes & Noble, who may or may not be walking away from that market. But you can put a standard flavor of Jelly Bean on that, which may eliminate some of the reliability issues I've heard anecdotally from people using those tablets. It's nice hardware. And I got to say, for $129, I'm thinking about hitting Barnes & Noble on the way home from the podcast today to pick one of those up. Don't tell my wife, please. Okay. And SSDs are getting seriously freaking cheap. I was just thinking about this. I got a question today. Somebody's looking for a 500 GB SSD. What's the best deal on the best SSD, for my MacBook Pro? And I'm like, la, 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 la. And I pull up Samsung 500 GB SSD on Amazon.com. Upper left-hand corner, Samsung 840 500 GB SATA 3 2.5-inch drive, $332.95. I think I helped sell 4 of those this afternoon.
Pretty good.
Yeah, considering like the 830 is still selling for like $550. There's another 840 that's selling for $359. $332 for a half a terabyte. That was unthinkable 6 months ago, much less a year ago. So we keep telling you that SSDs are getting cheaper, and they are. In a really big way. We want to remind everybody, if you have an email question, you can email us at Twitch, TWICH at twit.tv. And if you're new to the show, welcome. We're glad you're here. We want you to listen to all the shows, watch all the shows. Go up to twit.tv/Twitch. Subscribe if you're into that kind of thing, and we hope you are. Subscriptions drive the show and keep us going, as do our sponsors. Email from Flash about Haswell overclocking. And I just love this. I'm thinking about buying a Haswell i7 4770 or an i7 4670 non-K part, and was wondering if it can be overclocked just a little to like 4.2 or so. Or is it not possible, like Tom's Hardware writes here? So we just tell him no?
I think we talked about that, right? So
let's make it clear.
I think the only overclocking that you can do on these non-K series parts is you could increase the multiplier for all cores up to the highest that the single core would normally go to. So if your part's max clock speed is 3.9 gigahertz, that's usually 3.9 gigahertz only with a single core running, and then it kind of scales down as more cores work. I think the only kind of overclocking you do is you can kind of force everything to run at that top, maybe a couple of steps above that. So you are fairly limited on what you can do with the non-K series parts. But I will say that Haswell, the first kind of reports out of Haswell is it's not as friendly as for overclocking as Ivy Bridge or Sandy Bridge was. You know, I was able to get 4.5 gigahertz out of my part, and I think I saw a couple of the reviewers that got 4.6 and one that got 4.7, and a lot of them were in the 4.5 and maybe even a 4.4 or so range down there. So you may not be able to get much more out of even an unlocked part than you would have been able to get with Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge. So I keep that in mind. I mean, the price difference, the 4670 versus the 4770, I think the 4670 is still a hyper-threaded part, right? I think that's okay. Yeah. If it's still hyper-threaded, then, yeah, fine. No, actually, let me see here. Let me double check this. No, so the 4670 is 4 cores, 4 threads. Right. Whereas the 4770 is 4 cores, 8 threads. So there's a performance difference there, regardless of what your overclocking capability is actually at. So that's something to keep in mind too.
Do you feel like overclocking is just having less and less of an overall benefit the more advanced processors get, or am I just getting old and crotchety and lazy?
No, I mean, it's definitely the case, right? That overclocking is, it's not having, we're still seeing, a healthy percentage of overclocking in terms of relative frequencies, but we're getting into that mentality of, for most applications, for most users, the default speed of a 4770K is plenty fast, and you're only overclocking either for fun, for bragging rights, or very, very specific application workloads. If you do a lot of video transcoding or video encoding or something like that, where you get an advantage out of that. We, on our streaming machine, when we have 4 instances of Skype running and we're doing all this other kind of stuff, we actively had to overclock the system we were using in order to get the performance level that we needed. So there are cases where that's important, but I don't, to me, overclocking is maybe becoming less necessary for a lot of people. But if you look at some of the ways that you can overclock now, MSI has their the push button OC Genie.
I was going to say, overclocking becomes unbelievably easy. Unbelievably easy. The computer can overclock itself.
Exactly, right? We showed that ASUS software that kind of we'll test everything and reboot when it crashes and test everything, and then when it's done, it says, okay, you're good, and you can just do that, right? And it's not the same for the enthusiasts, for like the gearheads that want to get in and play around with that kind of stuff. But it's easy now. It's easy enough now where I would almost say you might as well do it, right? Unless you have some serious stability concerns where it's mission critical type stuff. Just run the software, hit the button, do the thing, and see how much more speed you get out of it, because you're not paying anymore for that. Which is always speaks
truth. Guys, take it. You get a little more horsepower out of the engine, take it, people. Rich has a question about Ivy Bridge price drops. He said, I'm looking to upgrade my tower system. I would like to see about getting an i7 Ivy Bridge with a motherboard and at least 16 gigabytes of RAM. I feel that. I don't do any gaming, but in my career, I use a lot of virtualization. Stay away from those K processors, buddy. I currently run an Ubuntu host system with guests of other Linux distros, all Windows versions, and don't say it too loud, Snow Leopard, Mountain Lion. I already have an SSD, dual 2 terabyte hard disk drives, and a 600 watt power supply. It has been suggested to me to keep the cost around $350. Do you have any insight to possible Intel Ivy Bridge price drops or any other ideas to help fit into my boss's, the amazing spouse's suggested budget constraints? Thanks for all of your thoughts on this and all the hard work. Thank you for emailing and listening, Rich. I don't think there's going to be a precipitous drop off in Ivy Bridge prices.
There hasn't been yet. I know that.
You know, there's just not a whole lot of the parts out in the market, and it's a very. I just feel like it's gonna. I think Intel is just gonna let Ivy Bridge run through the channel for as long as it takes, and then just ease in Haswell. Because like on laptops, where there's this dramatic difference, maybe not in performance, but certainly in battery life. You know, if what we're seeing, if what Tim Stevens over in Gadget is a typical experience, like, you know, 13 hours of battery life is effectively doubling the performance of the previous MacBook Air. That is a big deal. In terms of desktop performance, it's not a really big deal. You know what I mean? It's like, ooh, there's more graphics. But the people who are running integrated graphics are running their desktop and pretty much nothing else that requires 3D acceleration. So they're not going to really have a profound need for this. The gamers are not going to see a huge boost in performance off of the Haswell processor. You know, I just feel like this is one where Intel is going to take their time. And of course, now that I've said that, I'm sure I will open up a window on Amazon and find out that, you know, the 3770K has dropped like $100 in the last 10 minutes.
I just did a little bit of searching just to see the 3770K was down to like 319 on Newegg. Sure. And the 4770K is 349 on Newegg. They were both about 349 when Haswell launched, so it's come down a little bit. But all indications that I have is that the supply of Haswell parts is not like through the roof. So it's possible that if Haswell were to sell through very quickly, I think maybe you would see price differences kind of fluctuate a little bit more. But it's almost like they, rather than replace a part, they kind of just added a part to the market. And because of that, I don't know if we'll see the price drops as quickly as I had originally hoped. You know, keep an eye out. You never know what you can find. Specials on Micro Center, if you have one near you, sells processors at a cost that I can't understand how they do. You can get a 3770K there for $249.
Right. Well, it's funny. I was looking at, like, you know, as I pulled up 3770K on Amazon.com, it's like, you know, yeah, $319.12 for the 3770K. The i5 3570K quad core processor that's running at 3.4 gigahertz is $210. What's the performance VIG between the 3570K and the 3770K?
So the difference there is hyperthreading, just like the difference between the 47 and the 46. The difference between the 37 and 35 is hyperthreading. So you're talking about a quad core without hyperthreading. So you're talking at most 30 to 40%, depending on that specific workload, where you get that hyperthreading advantage.
Hyperthreading doesn't help with virtualization.
See, actually, it might, right? And so it's got a good chance of that. I would, you know, depending on how much, you know, if you're virtualizing a couple of small machines, it's not that big a deal. But if you're trying to get performance out of those virtualized machines, then the more processing power you can get, the better. But, you know, pay attention to the feature differences between a 4770 and a 4770K, right? Because we talked about that earlier in the show in terms of virtualization changes, TSX changes, and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Oops, sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say you could put together a pretty ripping $500 upgrade with a Core i7 3770K motherboard and 16 gigabytes of RAM right now. You won't get the fanciest motherboard. You're probably not going to have Thunderbolt, but I suspect if you're running Ubuntu, you're not really thinking a lot about Thunderbolt. emails from ticked off Ubuntu users that like Thunderbolt.
It
One more question before we go.
Right.
After this insanely news heavy week, what's crazy is like we've talked for an hour and we skipped like 6 news stories this week.
Yeah, I know. I was looking through the rundown of that. Yeah.
We got an email from Joe about the SSD bottleneck. He says, lately I'm noticing a lot of SSD drives have an upward limit of 550 megabyte read, 550 megabit read, 550 megabit write speeds due to the current limitations of SATA specs. My question is, if the OCZ Revo drive was able to overcome these SATA limits by connecting directly to the PCI Express bus, are there similar options for people with SATA-based SSDs to bypass the SATA bottleneck? Short answer, not unless you can engineer a solution, because I'm not allowed to use marketing terms like solution in day-to-day speech. Unless you can actually figure out a way to connect the memory chips in the SSD directly to the PCI Express bus. And, you know, there's at least one person out here in the audience who went to MIT and is really, really, really good with surface mount components that can do it. But for the vast majority of us, a SATA device requires a SATA interface, period.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way to take a SATA drive that you have and somehow magically
not
make
SATA
it. I mean, but so he mentions the OCZ Revo drive. You can, I mean, that's a consumer directed product, and it has a much higher price than the SATA SSDs as well. And we talked about earlier in the show how Apple was implementing PCI Express based SSDs into the new MacBook Air and into the new Mac Pro whenever it comes out. And so that's something that the MacBook Air is something that's shipping today. It will probably have a fallback effect of, you know, pushing other people down that road as well. The M.2 interface, which is starting to kind of show up in other systems. You can get an Asus higher end Asus Z87 motherboard that has an M.2 interface, which will run at those higher speeds. And so there are options there, but there's nothing that you can take your current hardware with that I know of, take your current hardware with and somehow make it faster, right? Because the problem is, even if you could, I mean, there's a SATA controller on the end of that SSD before it even gets to the cable. It's not like it's passing the data through the cable faster, and the SATA control on the motherboard kind of slows it down. So it's just a fundamental controller difference.
Yeah, I mean, what Apple is doing is essentially directly connecting a giant pile of memory to PCI Express. We have seen hardware you can buy that will put a giant pile of memory on a PCI Express card and attach it to the PCI Express bus. It's fast. It's expensive. You could build an AMD has the Radeon RAM disk software, which is free to download. So if you want to buy, you know, if you can find a motherboard that'll support 64 gigabytes of RAM, you could probably throw 32 or 48 gigabytes at that RAM disk and have PCI Express level, well, faster than PCI Express performance, right? Because you're storing things on the main system memory. But you know, no matter how you, unless you can physically connect the RAM inside of that SSD to your motherboard through your astonishing engineering skill, there is no way to not pass your bits through the SATA interface. It is what it is. You can rip the SATA interface off, but then you'll have a piece of dead hardware that you can't use.
Or paperweight, you know, if you leave your windows open during the day, something like that.
Oh my goodness. Something to throw for a cat toy. Let's just call it a cat toy at this point. We're gonna have to end this week in computer hardware at this point, because otherwise we will keep talking for hours. I mean, you know, go up to pcper.com. There's some good stuff up there. Gigabyte's got the most ridiculous Titan cooler ever. It may be the ultimate Titan, or it just may be the most out of control GPU cooler ever. Ultra GPUs made a return at Computex. AMD wants you to know there's a Radeon HD 7970 for $400 and $419. MSI has a ripping new mobile gaming box, a gaming laptop to use language that most of the audience will actually understand, rather than me calling it a mobile gaming portable system. Of course, the Xbox One and the PS4 have been battling it out this week at E3. There's thousands and thousands of game reviews up there. I've been really enjoying watching Adam and Max and Tara and battle their way through the E3 mayhem. That's the crew we work with from Rev3 Games. Yeah, they've just been. It's funny when you watch people, like one person's like, I'm really into this game, the other person's, I'm really into this game, and you think like these people game differently.
Yeah.
But some exciting stuff, man. Did you see a single video game that got you excited while you were walking around watching other people play video games at E3? Rayman? Come on. Rayman?
No,
you're a big Rayman fan.
I did like Titanfall. That was a really impressive one graphically. I think it's going to come to the I think it may come to the PC as well. But I will say, from a console point of view, seeing the the PlayStation booth was way better organized and put together than the Microsoft booth for Xbox One, just in terms of how it was set up and designed. And I came away much more impressed with the demos I saw at the PlayStation 4 booth than I did the Xbox One booth. That's really? Completely just based on presentation, probably. But that's why you have good people that set up these presentations at shows like this. So I like, you look at games like Assassin's Creed 4 that's coming out. That's going to be on the PC. Watch Dogs out on the PC. Those are really good looking games with at least in Watch Dogs' case, very unique gameplay options that I'm looking forward to trying out.
Should be exciting. I got to interview the Mythbusters yesterday morning. Jamie and Adam from the Mythbusters were on Techzilla, which is up on techzilla.com. I was excited. I was very pleased that I did not pee on the floor like an overexcited puppy. Probably not as pleased as my mother is. Although she's probably not going to be thrilled to see me describing my emotional state as being puppy-like and my wanting to pee on the floor with excitement. It's been an interesting week. We got some new flat panels from LG coming up next week on HD Nation, which is up on revision3.com/HDNation again. And some interesting, Panasonic did a home theater in a box with 3 speakers. And Robert and I are going to have an argument about whether or not that's just the dumbest idea for a home theater in the box ever.
All right.
LG's got a really interesting new flat panel we got in, and we're playing around a lot actually with dealing with 5.1 surround sound systems, because we've had a lot of questions lately around 5.1, 7.1, and how much wattage you need, which is a big conversation we had. And I also got to say, Comcast, if you're listening, I promise I will upgrade my modem to DOCSIS 3 tonight. But this thing where your marketing people call and hang up without leaving a message to remind me that I need a DOCSIS 3 modem, it's driving me nuts. Because you keep doing it while my kid's trying to go to sleep at 7 o'clock at night, and you're pissing me off.
Well, now I definitely hope they're listening.
PC Purr, what's coming up this week, man?
Let's see what we got this week. We actually have quite a few things. We kind of held back on posting some reviews that had finished because of the E3 noise and wanted to get lost on that. I have probably tomorrow I'm going to put up a GTX 780M mobility graphics review. Compare that to AMD's 7970M. We have a Gigabyte 787 review coming up, and a review of the Lenovo Yoga 11 Tegra powered 11-inch laptop tablet combo thing, which is kind of interesting. It's weird. We're in this field now where I've gotten in several Haswell based laptops, but then some of those really innovative designs that we saw at CES that are based on Ivy Bridge are just now starting to show up as well. So things like the Lenovo Helix, I don't know if you remember seeing that at CES.
A little bit.
It just started shipping last week, and they're like, oh, we got a review sample for you. And I'm like, okay, send it over. But now it's kind of painted in a totally different light. So it's going to be interesting to see how our opinions are changed. If the battery life is so much better on Haswell than Ivy Bridge across a large scale test base, then buying an Ivy Bridge machine may be a bad decision. But if it's closer, then the design differences might be able to offset it. So it'll be an interesting couple weeks.
To paraphrase Robert Heinlein, time is a cruel mistress.
Yeah.
That's about it for this week in computer hardware. More exciting news next week. More exciting viewer questions next week, but only if you email us. Twitch, twich@twit.tv is the email address. You can find more episodes of This Week in Computer Hardware up at twit.tv/Twitch. I want to thank everybody for listening. Hope we hear you next week, or hope I am heard by you. Ryan and I are heard by you next week. English, difficult language. That's it for this episode of Twitch. I'm Patrick Norton.
I'm Ryan Schraub.
We'll see you next week.